ocurría algo a desaparecer.
Welcome to Interview from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, I'll be your host, as we look at Mexico from a fresh perspective, through the eyes of the men and women who are changing the nation, here on Telesur. Today we're going to be talking about interventions, independence, and integration in Latin America. The continent has experienced a continuous series of foreign interventions, and now many nations are trying to break out of that dynamic and plot a new course. What do all these changes mean for Latin America? To talk about this issue, we're very fortunate to have with us Luis Suarez, a researcher at the Higher Institute on Foreign Relations and a professor at the University of Havana. Luis, you've been studying foreign interventions in Latin America for many, many years and also been looking at the current situation. What would you think are some of the recurring themes in that history of interventions in the region?
Bueno, la historia de las intervenciones es larguísima de Estados Unidos.
Well, the history of intervention is very long of the United States in this continent. Here in Mexico, I always recommend reading a classic book, which is the history, an encyclopedia really, of foreign interventions in Latin America, compiled by a fine historian, academic, Argentine, but who lived a long time and worked here in Mexico, who is Gregoria Seltzer. There's a history there that practically starts at the very moment that the United States becomes an independent country, when it gets its independence from Great Britain and begins to elaborate a line of thought of the fathers, the founding fathers, regarding what is the role of Latin America, or America as a whole, in terms of their leadership. From there on, with varied intensity throughout the 19th century, we begin to see the direct military intervention on the part of the United States, of which, of course, one of the most egregious was the division and occupation of Mexican territory in 1848 to 1849. Afterward, the dynamic continues in the 19th century after the so-called Spanish-American War, and that inaugurates a brutal era of U.S. intervention, of U.S. occupation in various countries of the Caribbean: Cuba, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, permanent interventions of various years. Not to mention other types of interventions that they carried out to supposedly mediate conflicts. All interventions justified in defense of the interests of North American citizens and for stability in the continent. And this went on throughout the 20th century. And I think in another form, all this is still present in the intervention in the 21st century, for the huge implications of the United States and U.S. policies and the security strategy that has been developed in the continent, with themes like drug trafficking and narco-traffic, and the implications, even denounced by the Washington Post, of the participation of U.S. armed forces and the intelligence community in conflicts as bloody as that of Colombia, or in lethal operations like the one in Honduras, including the death of and virtual assassination of innocent people, innocent persons, in the name now of the battle against drug trafficking. It's a very long list of interventions.
And why do you think Latin America in particular has been such an important staging ground for foreign interventions?
Well, we're talking about the United States because there are also many foreign military interventions of England, France, and others in Latin America. But these interventions took place especially and very identifiably throughout mostly the 19th century. As the United States starts transforming into the hegemonic power, the dominant power in the continent, and as England, France, and Holland begin to accept that for the United States, Latin America and the Caribbean, which we can't forget, is a central area of North American influence, the interventions become to be taken on by the United States directly, with help, participation, sometimes without participation, sometimes without support, but the United States becomes into the major interventionist force in Latin American affairs, in everything. And yesterday, I said, for example, in my presentation, the presentation that I did, I recalled that we can't forget the last and most shameful intervention of the United States in the continent. The last two, let's say, but the intervention in Panama in 1989. With the pretext, first military intervention that used the pretext of combating drug trafficking against the drug trafficking. First time also that the United States captured a statesman, whatever our judgment in relation to is of Manuel Noriega is, to be tried in U.S. courts, correct? We have this entire dimension. There are other things that unfortunately are not talked about a lot. The intervention in Haiti, or the successive interventions in Haiti, the intervention that the Clinton administration carried out, and afterward the intervention of the George W. Bush, where they practically took the ex-president prisoner and took Aristide to Africa, where also U.S. military interventions occurred. The participation of the United States in the Civil War and the Colombian internal conflict is really intense, has been really intense, and continues to be really intense. When Plan Colombia was authorized, it authorized the presence of approximately 1,500 military personnel and contractors from the United States in the context of Plan Colombia. And this intervention is still going on. The contractors are still there. All the agreements with the Joint Commands, with armed forces and the Southern Command, with the military forces of Colombia.
Well, the United States has insisted on having hegemony in the region over the years, and this is the major reason behind many of these examples of intervention that you've given us. Do you see this role changing at all now that Latin America itself is changing?
Of course, and I'll be very clear. I have the impression that there is an important sector of the dominant class in the United States, of the political, bureaucratic, military apparatus in the United States, what I sometimes call the permanent government, that has arrived at the conclusion that it has to deal with a Latin America that has changed. And they act based on the criteria that they have to interact with a continent that is not the same. There is a very short phrase that the Vice President Joe Biden said. Someone asked if Latin America and the Caribbean was still the backyard of the United States. And he said, no, Latin America and the Caribbean is the edge of the front yard of the United States.
Luis, we were talking about how in this latest period, the United States has been forced to recognize that Latin America has changed. How has this changed U.S. policy toward the region?
My impression is that this understanding that Latin America changed, and that it has to play a different role in the global politics of the United States, not just in the hemispheric politics, but in global politics, has been progressively recognized in some of Vice President Joe Biden's speeches. Speeches where Biden calls even on the United States business community to understand the growing role that the continent has in trade and investments, and in themes of what he calls the rise of a middle class with consumer capacity to consume U.S. products, and the opportunities this opens to the United States precisely to resolve its own economic crises.
Para resolver sus propias crisis económicas.
This you can find also in the last book published by the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, where she starts her chapter on Latin America saying to the readers, normally when we think of commercial ties, we think that commercial ties are more important with Europe, are more important with China. Latin America is still our main trade partner.
Well, does this mean that there will be more cooperation and less imposition on the part of the United States?
I think it's going to be a mixture of policies. Sometimes I use this same phrase made popular in the United States of so-called poder inteligente, the so-called smart power. It is the application of a new combination of policies where the military and security components don't disappear, but other components enter into what we can call diplomatic components. They come in, also the so-called smart power, the public diplomacy, the offensive diplomatic diplomacy that the United States has been developing in the last years, in the last months. Biden has met, or Obama, with 30 Latin American presidents, individually and collectively, some with more than others than one meeting. As soon as there is a change in president, automatically the United States moves to reestablish the link with the new president. The only leaders of Latin America and the Caribbean that they haven't met with, presidents or prime ministers of course, have been Raul Castro, Nicolás Maduro, and Evo Morales. With all the rest, they've had more than one meeting in this diplomatic offensive. And on the level of the Pentagon, there is a Pentagon document called the U.S. Hemispheric Defense Policy that goes to 2023. That was announced in October of 2012 when León Panetta was still Secretary of Defense. And it talks about the necessity to form a new generation of military alliances with Latin America, with those Latin American countries that are willing to share with the United States the costs and responsibilities in the defense of the security of the Western Hemisphere. Of course, and in light of the major pivot that the U.S. Armed Forces have to make towards the Asian-Pacific region.
Well, are we then maybe seeing two policies, one toward governments that have free trade agreements and alliances with the United States, and a different one toward the center-left governments in the region?
I'm talking about a mixture of policies. The issue of free trade enters again in a new way, with the combination that the United States is attempting between the Pacific Alliance with Latin America that was founded not long ago between the governments of Mexico, of Colombia, of Peru, and of Chile, at the same time with what is being negotiated in the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, what they call in English the TPP, which is the free trade agreement of a new generation of free trade agreements. And they are trying to articulate the whole Pacific arc, as they call it, of Latin America that goes from this continent, from this hemisphere, that goes from Canada to Tierra del Fuego, this agreement that they are promoting, of course, with the goal of being able to contain or compete, or whatever you want to call it, with the rise of China as a global power, and give it, and that the Latin Americans participate. They're even envisioning even the possibility that Colombian military forces that have become, Colombia has become in this moment the main military partner of the United States on the continent, since Plan Colombia, but now the agreements with Colombia we've talked a lot about, like the famous military bases, are agreements that would convert Colombia, and it's already transforming into one of the principal training centers of military forces and of police in the rest of Latin America, taking on the infamous role of the so-called School of the Americas in a certain moment. According to recent statistics, between 2009 and 2013, they have trained more than 22,000 military and police forces in Colombia from all over Latin America.
And what role does Mexico play in all these changes within the continent?
I think they're trying to create an alliance with Mexico, Colombia, Peru, in some cases. The part that has to do with the Andean region and Chile, that has to do with the northern part, what they call the Pacific Arc. They are trying to forge a new alliance. When we see, for example, the military budgets of military aid and police aid for 2014, according to the statistics available, the first recipient of military aid is still Colombia, and the second is Mexico. And also, within this training model that we're talking about, of training of military and police, when we look at it, the largest number are Mexican military officials and police agents. About 40%. I can't remember the exact number at this moment. The rest are Central American military personnel. And so, if we look at the other side and see, for example, the so-called summit held here in Toluca for the 20th anniversary of the North American Free Trade Agreement, where the Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Obama, and Peña Nieto participated in the agreements and states the new role of Canada and, of course, of the United States and of Mexico, not only in raising new standard of free trade through the Pacific Alliance or Treaty of the TPP, but also the role that Canada and Mexico should play along with the United States in security issues regarding Central America and the Caribbean. So there's projection to involve Mexico more and more in the challenge of other countries of Latin America. Colombia, we talked about that case, Chile and Peru. But the idea is that Mexico also participates in this new policy, let's call it new, that the United States is employing. It still has the same objectives, yes, to maintain the system of domination, but they are trying to achieve a new generation of alliances with the governments of Latin America and the Caribbean.
We're back talking to Luis Suarez about shifting alliances in Latin America and what that means for the future. Luis, one of the main features that we've seen in terms of these changes has been the creation of more South-South alliances and even institutions like the Union of South American Countries and the Community of Latin American Nations. What do these new institutions and organizations mean for the policies that we're seeing from the United States and the counter-hegemonic efforts that we're seeing from the South?
Well, whenever I talk about these issues, Laura, I say that the establishment of UNASUR and the CELAC was not necessarily desirable for the United States policy. The United States has worked throughout history to strengthen the inter-American system, to strengthen the OAS, the American Joint Defense Alliance, to avoid the creation of Latin American organizations autonomous from U.S. policy in the continent. But at this point, both UNASUR and the CELAC are a political reality. Now, in my opinion, what the mainstream U.S. policy is doing is to seek a way to interact with these institutions so that they do not become obstacles or adversaries to their hemispheric policy, right? Moreover, there's reality there. In these new alliances that we're talking about, that the United States is trying to forge with different Latin American governments. These governments are part of UNASUR and CELAC. So, through their relationships, their associations with these other governments, the United States can advance, can try to advance their policies in these institutions in an indirect way through these other governments. Now, in this moment, for example, in the document of the Pentagon, what is the objective of the Pentagon? To try to arrive to an agreement with UNASUR, a joint policy of defense and security that includes UNASUR, because within UNASUR they have very close relations, as we saw with Colombia, with Peru, with Chile, with Paraguay, which is a new element. And they are trying to build a new relationship with Brazil, because they know that a new relationship with Brazil can have a major implications for the future of UNASUR. And they are acting against Venezuela, against the Bolivarian Revolution, because they know that if they achieve their purpose, their dream of toppling the Maduro government, it will weaken UNASUR. So there are policy components that in turn affect CELAC.
And what implications does all this have for the Organization of American States, for example?
For example, faced with the reality that we now have a community of states in Latin America and the Caribbean, a law has been proposed It's bipartisan, called for the revitalization and reform of the Organization of American States. Under the conception that the Organization of American States is the favored regional organization, it's the organization that must be strengthened. They know they can't change the nature of the CELAC, so they move to strengthen the Inter-American System, the OAS. So the Pentagon in turn directs efforts to trying to fortify the American Defense Alliance, to try to strengthen all those instruments that historically the United States has used in its relationships with the armed forces and police forces. That includes the Conference of Armies, of the Navy, Chiefs of Army, of the Navy, of Aviation, that they still carry out in an underground way training of high-level officials in the School of the Americas, in the institute that they have in the United States. There's a whole area of policies that are aimed at offsetting, weakening, challenging, if we can call it that, avoiding the deepening of this Latin American agreements that have arisen outside the United States, out of their will, and out of the official policies of the United States in this case. For this reason, in the future, we're going to be experiencing in the continent this contradiction between Pan-Americanism and Latin Americanism. The United States will continue to promote its Pan-Americanism, and the forces of Latin America that seek the vision of creating the broad homeland, that want to create the Bolivarian dream, we have to continue to defend the construction of Latin American and Caribbean institutions that have autonomy from U.S. policy, that can participate in the construction of a multipolar world
that's
that we are moving
fascinating.
towards.
Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our interview, and that's exactly what I wanted to ask you. With these new institutions and the changes that are taking place, are we seeing a real advance toward a multipolar world led by Latin America?
It's happening. There are some enormously important processes in terms of the construction of this multipolar world. To talk about recent events, the meeting of the BRICS held in Brazil. Only about 2 months ago, the relation that the BRICS group establishes, and the ties that China, Russia seek to establish precisely with Latin American counterparts, with Brazil, with Argentina, with Cuba, with UNISUR. The meeting between BRICS and UNISUR, all this points to the multipolar world that is emerging. But we always have to remember that the United States, even though it recognizes that a multipolar world is emerging, always wants to be the hegemon, always wants to be the leader of these global processes that are happening against its will. And the United States has developed policies to make sure that this multipolarity does not become a multipolarity that goes against its strategic interests, economic and geopolitical interests. This is not unlike what is happening with Russia and the whole conflict around Ukraine. The way they're trying to hem in Russia. Again, read what Hillary Clinton says in her recent book. They seek to convert Putin into the main enemy. He's the enemy, the adversary. It's as if they were creating a new Cold War. And look at the way they refer to Russia now. The role of Putin, the importance that the American and the United States gives to trying to counteract the influence of Russia in Latin America.
Well, these are certainly fascinating shifts we're seeing in Latin America. Luis Suarez, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for you.
And thank you for joining us here on Interview from Mexico.